the question. What is your sense then? Are authorities likely to just try and manage these protests as best as they can, even if they start spreading? Because, I mean, the correlation here is, the more days you have record numbers and the tighter restrictions become, the more the protests are also going to escalate. Or do you think the authorities are at a point where, as opposed to focusing on the virus and restrictions, they start turning their attention on more to the protesters and crack down?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I think your question is interesting because the virus is also a key actor in this situation. And the virus is something the government cannot control. So we've seen already that, we're not going back to zero. It's not working. The cases continue to rise, even in the face of very kind of strict control measures, some would say draconian. And so I don't think that there's a easy way out for the government. And at the end of the day, the decision-making process around this is quite opaque. I'm not sure what we're going to see now. I will say that I think it's going to be a tough, hard winter regardless, because there are essentially kind of two options to think about. One, crack down on the virus even harder with stricter lockdowns and more stringent controls. That will, of course, further damage an economy that's already been tanked by these policies and further kind of fuel some of the unrest, because partially it's economic, that is driving the frustrations, the expressions of frustration that we're seeing. The other option, of course, is to relax the virus in some way. But then in order to kind of maintain control, you'll have to have a political tightening to some extent. So I think it remains a tight and tense situation.
Matti, so when you see steps like the RRR cut, is that meaningless unless it's combined with a relaxation of COVID-19, draconian COVID-19 policy?
On some sense, I'm afraid so. I think, candidly, both consumer and investor confidence has been so damaged by these policies that you're not going to see any recovery in any meaningful sense until there's a shift. I mean, we've already seen markets move quite significantly based on rumors that Beijing was going to relax, right? That was just a few weeks ago. And so it'll be curious to see. I mean, I think the markets that have opened so far are facing the uncertainty of China, but in a more modest and muted response way. I think we're going to see, perhaps especially as we watch the markets open across the world, a more directed response. Overall, I think the challenge is, if in nothing else, China has been, over the last 2 decades, prized for its, not only its remarkable growth, but its stability and its security. And so not only with the growth slowdown, but especially now with instability and kind of the uncertainty about what might happen moving forward, investors, markets don't respond well to that.
Right, and in terms of what markets are looking for, Matti, it's of course the rhetoric. And, when you talk about this narrative and the amount of political capital that's been invested in this, obviously very hard to go back on that, as you suggest. But has there been any indication from on the ground there, at least in places like Shanghai where you are, of any sort of shift in the tone or the messaging or the communication as to how the policymakers are making Chinese citizens feel about this virus, that this is not as deadly, the vaccines are working, we can crack on with our lives? Because, as I mentioned at the top of my report, there has seemingly been a little bit of criticism about one size fits all. There doesn't seem to be an appetite for the blanket lockdowns anymore.
Yes, there's definitely frustration with the blanket lockdowns. And, surprisingly, even the broadcasts of the World Cup have been a little bit of an own goal for China, because it was the first time that you had many Chinese football fans seeing that the rest of the world has moved on and that tens and thousands of fans can fill a stadium without masks. We have not seen any kind of evidence at the official level of a change in the narrative. And I think that's important, because in any other zero COVID country that transitioned from controlling the disease through border controls and lockdowns, testing, to controlling the virus with vaccinations and medication and kind of letting it spread through the population, there was first kind of a propaganda push or a messaging shift. And I think that would certainly be necessary here. The truth is, many citizens in China remain quite afraid of the virus because they've been told it's very deadly. And that has not changed, to my knowledge.
Matti, a couple of seconds ago, we referred to the opacity of Chinese decision making. You got to figure the protests that we're seeing right now, part of it is also simply anger, not just at the opacity, but at the inconsistency of Chinese decision making, because in Shanghai, the commercial capital, right, where this seems to be becoming much more political than in other cities, it wasn't that long ago that folks there were being told, hey, look, you may not have to go to have as many tests now. And then suddenly, boom, restrictions come back in. So it's sort of like they dangled a carrot out, and whoever was feeling a little claustrophobic thought, okay, great, finally some relief. And then they cracked down again with more restrictions. I mean, there's got to be a sense of anchor to that too, no?
There is, Martin, and I think it's also interesting, that this is something that affects everyone, because everyone's lives are compromised to some extent. And, Shanghai is traditionally more of a business-focused city, less concerned with politics. And yet the gathering point for the kind of protests in Shanghai, first it started at a vigil and kind of turned into a protest, you could say, was Urumqi Lu, or Urumqi Road. So that's actually directly linked to the deadly fire in Urumqi. And that is actually quite a political statement right there. That's not something you would necessarily expect to see. And it also comes not without risk. I mean, there's a lot of bravery being displayed, even if it's, fairly small numbers, that people feel they can leave their homes. You've seen it also in Beijing, go to a location and that others will join them. And even if it is young people who tend to kind of start these gatherings, they're joined by all people from all walks of society. So I do think the kind of uncertainty and then the carrots being dangled, so to speak. There was this announcement that we were going to see a relaxation. You've also interestingly seen a lot of both the protesters, but also a lot of the online complaints about the new guidelines not being adhered to, focus in terms of rule of law, and saying, this is, I'm challenged the legality of you asking me to isolate because I'm in close contact. That's not permitted anymore. And even some of the protesters here in Shanghai, one gentleman was walking with flowers and he was saying, is this a crime to walk on the street with flowers? Is this against the law? And so there's a hunger for kind of accountability and I think legitimacy behind the actions.
Matty, has this leadership painted itself into a corner by refusing to import mRNA vaccines, and have they done so out of nationalistic and political reasons?
That would have been a very obvious policy lever to pull to allow for the relaxation of the stringent controls, allowing, mRNA vaccines to be widely distributed and used as a tool. There are many tools that you can deploy against COVID, would have, of course, allowed, given the government more room to maneuver. The reason for doing so, and there are several, but I think the main reason has been linked to national security concerns. The Chinese government indicated that it did not want to be reliant on foreign vaccines and wanted to rely instead on homegrown Chinese vaccines. There has been a lot of talk over the last few years about a Chinese mRNA vaccine, but to date we have not seen that be implemented across the country. So I do think that was one kind of lost opportunity for China. Whereas we saw lockdowns in the West and the language from the governments tended to be, we need to have these stringent controls now to buy time so that we can get the vaccines up and running, so that we can get people vaccinated, and then you're going to get your liberties back. And I think that's part of the frustration here. The lockdowns just feel endless and relentless because there's no kind of timeline in sight. There doesn't appear to be, a widespread vaccination campaign or a booster campaign, again, even with the Chinese vaccines. Importation of mRNA vaccines, any of the other mechanisms, change in the narrative that would allow for a softening of the approach.
Indeed, yeah, and that was something that Dr. Anthony Fauci was talking about as well, saying the lockdowns were not so much pointless, but really without an end or without a goal. Maddie, listen, we got to go. Fantastic talking to you. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Matty.
Please continue to keep safe where you are. We'll do it again very soon. Maddie Bekink from the Economist Corporate Network, and our good colleague Sam Otis, part of the conversation as well. We're back in 2.